Thank you, Katie. Good to be with you again this evening. How many have been to Egypt or any of these places? Oh, good. You won't know what I'm... Oh, there's one lady. She'll be able to check up on me. All right, we're going to go to some amazing places tonight as we take a journey looking at Prophetica. Let's get straight into it. Our first presentation tonight, Amazing Discoveries in Lost Civilizations. We're going back to the past and ancient civilizations and forward to the future this evening. Many people are concerned today about what is happening on many fronts in our world. Think of the terrible crisis that's unraveling in Gaza and Lebanon and between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah and all of that sort of thing. And the potential that has to draw in more nations. Then there's the Ukraine war, where they've been talking nuclear from time to time, you've probably noticed. On top of that, we have the increasing tensions between China and the United States over Taiwan and other things that where both of them are caught up together. And then we have in our own country rising crime rates. Crime rates around the world, many places out of control almost. And away in the background we have climate issues, where we are polluting and destroying our planet in many ways today around the world. And then ticking away in the background is the fragile global economy. Many economists believe it's not a case of if, but when the house of cards falls in on top of us. And many people worried about that. And of course, those sorts of issues are causing many people to ask this vital question. What does the future hold? Where are we actually heading in our world? Now, the ancients were very interested in the future as well. It's very fascinating to notice. We could come here to Delphi in Greece, where the famous Oracle of Delphi was situated. Now, many famous people came here in the past to consult the Oracle of Delphi. What was this all about? Well, in the Temple of Apollo, there in Delphi, there was a crack between the rocks, and over the crack sat some, we call them Pythias. These were ladies, like priestesses, who would sit over this crack in the rock where the gases were coming up, and they were said to make predictions. They would sit on a tripod stool and make these predictions. And as I said, some very famous people consulted the Oracle of Delphi. People like Alexander the Great, and then of course we have people like Nero and others consulted. They wanted to know what the future held in their time. And even today, of course, where many people, you go home and you type in the word predictions or prophecy or something of that nature, and you will see there's a lot of people looking into the future for various reasons, of course, but many people wanting to know where are we headed in the deeper sense of the word. I did it not long ago, 2.16 billion hits on it for people looking at where do we go in the future? What does the future hold? You think of the column centimetres in our newspapers and tabloid magazines, and you see the great increase in the column centimetres given to the psychics for the horoscopes and astrology charts and all of that sort of thing. It's increased because many people today want to know what the future holds, not just about their love life or their bank account, but where are we headed in the big scheme of things. I was in India some years ago, travelled right throughout India, but I came here to Benares, Varanasi as it's called for people living down under. But I was fascinated to notice right here in a very important site for the Hindu people, the Hindus, that there was someone had set up their astrology shop right there too. Doesn't matter where you go or in the world. I remember on the way home from this same tour that I had to take, got to Thailand, and there was someone reading people's palms in the market there. Wherever you go, people are wanting to know, what does the future hold? Some of you remember the year 2012, the Mayan calendar and all of that sort of thing. Remember, many were predicting that the world's going to end, but what happened? Well, nothing happened. Now, I'm not knocking anybody, but there were a lot of people making predictions back in 2012, but nothing happened. I'm just simply saying this is not an easy game to be in, the predictive business. How about the year 2000? Some of you remember the year 2000? What was supposed to happen? What was that bug? Y2K, exactly, man. The electricity grid was going to fall over and all sorts of things. But what happened? Nothing happened again. Now, as I said, I'm not making fun of anybody. I'm just making a point tonight. It's not easy to be in the predictive business. And in actual fact, these Times magazines a few years ago did a survey on the predictions of the psychics and so on. And they discovered in their survey that 6 out of 250 predictions were actually correct. Whoa, that's just 3%. It's not an easy game, is it? In fact, we now know the average leading psychics batting average, the average of the leading psychics is only 16%. So for every 100 predictions that are made, actually when you go back and look what happened, only 16 took place. So in other words, it's not an easy business to be in, the predictive business, which really brings us to this question here. Can we really know the future, or is it just wishful thinking on our part? We wish we could know the future. Well, if you wanted to know the future and you wanted to go to a source that said, listen, I can tell you what the future holds, you need to check up on 2 things with that source before you put your money down. Number one, you would want what we would call historical accuracy. What do we mean by that? We mean if this source that you consult cannot even get the facts about the past or the present right, how on earth can you trust them with the future? Because it's easy to know the past and the present more, but not the future. The second thing you'd want is you would want a proven track record of dependable predictions. In other words, you would want a batting average of 100%. Let me illustrate. Imagine that I said, I'm a guru on the stock market. Listen up. And I said to you, listen, tomorrow morning, Qantas shares are going to hit an all-time low, 1 cent a piece. But on Wednesday night, they're going to be worth $100 each. But on Friday morning, they're going to go back to 1 cent each. So I suggest to you that you borrow as much money as you can, maybe even mortgage, sell your house, do whatever it is, get as much cash as you can, and buy as many of those 1 cent shares you can tomorrow morning, but make sure you sell them off on Wednesday night when they're $100. Now, are you going to do that because Webster said so? Well, of course not. But I hope you would go Googling Webster. And if you found that Webster makes amazing predictions on the stock market, he got every single up and down on the stock market correct, you'd probably think serious now, right? Maybe I better take some of that money out and buy some of those Qantas shares. The point is, you want to know my batting average. Because if I predict wrong and you're on the wrong side of my batting average, you're in trouble maybe. All right, so that's what we're meaning. Now, is there such a source? Yes, there absolutely is, and we're going to share that with you, a tremendously reliable source with a batting average of 100%. And we're going to be going to university history and archaeology as for the evidence for that this evening, because it's been my privilege to study in both of those areas and to dig in the Middle East as well. Now, I want to talk about the 3 most important discoveries in archaeology. Digging up the past, we could call it. When we dig up the past. Now, not the most famous perhaps, but the most important. Probably the most famous would be King Tutankhamun's treasures, I guess. And that gets everybody's attention. Now, the first one is in Egypt. And this in the magnificent land of the Nile. What a marvellous place. You went to Egypt? Someone said they put their hand up. Yeah, marvellous place to visit. Ancient Egypt was a magnificent place. But we're not going to go back that far. We want to talk about Napoleon Bonaparte. He came to Egypt, and in 1798, his soldiers and those who were with him that came to Egypt, they discovered the famous Rosetta Stone. Now, this stone today is in the British Museum. Now, you can see it's in 3 sections. The top section is the hieroglyphic writings. Now, that was on the tombs and the temple walls and the papyrus documents we call, like paper, but nobody could read it. Tourists had come for centuries through Egypt, but they couldn't read this strange writing. Then in the middle is what we call a cursive Egyptian hieroglyph, type of hieroglyph. It's called demotic. Nobody could read that either. And then the bottom section, that's in Greek, and we could read that and have been able to read that for centuries. So they guessed this must be the same message, whatever it is, in 3 different scripts, 3 different languages, if you would. And of course, that was what it was. Now, they worked from the known Greek language at the bottom, because there were certain words like king kept cropping up in Greek, and then there were certain, like we call it the cartouche, kept popping up in different places in the hieroglyphs. So they worked, and it took them 20 years, and finally, thanks to a brilliant Frenchman by the name of Jean-Francois Champollion, they were able to decipher the strange writing. Now, what did that mean? It simply meant that now we could unlock the history, the culture, the religious practices, the medical practices of one of the greatest of ancient civilizations, Egypt. It was unlocked. All right, let's go to the second one. I've been 3 times to Iran. Very friendly people. I love the Iranian people. In fact, you know, I've travelled to the Middle East many times, but I only ever saw one person with a gun in Iran, and that was in a guard tower on an army base as we drove past. I guess you'd expect that. But you go to a place like Israel and sort of every man, woman and his dog's got a gun. Now, I'm just simply saying, it's for tourists, mostly it's a safe place. Maybe you wouldn't want to be in conflict, of course, with Iran, but, you know, but very friendly people. I love going there. And we've had a guide that's been with us twice now, and then another person before. Anyway, we want to come to Iran, and we want to come to the Silk Road, the road from China right across to the parts of Europe. Now, this is at a place called Kermanshah. There are some big cliffs, and just like people graffiti things today, the kings graffitied the walls of the cliffs back in those times as well. They put up their victories. Now, one of those, known as the Behistun inscription, you can see this king on the left there. It's King Darius. He's the guy that invaded Greece, and he had that battle with Leonidas and his, what was it, 300, 700, I've forgotten what it was now, at Thermopylae, you may recall that. He invaded Greece, and in this case, some guys have rebelled against him in Persia, and he's defeated them. It's not the story that's important, it's the fact that this is in 3 different scripts of Mesopotamia, in what they used, where they called it cuneiform, a rather strange writing. Nobody could read it. But thanks to this inscription and the risk that one man took to get an impression of this, they were able, after many years, to decipher this strange writing. Now, this was the language of the Sumerians, they lived down toward the Persian Gulf, the language of the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and many people used this strange script called cuneiform. So what did this mean? Now, thanks to people like Henry Rawlinson, a British soldier who was working for the British way back then, they were able to unlock the history, the culture, the religious practices, and all sorts of things of what is believed to be the cradle of civilization, where people moved out from there to other parts of the world. So we could read these strange clay tablets. We have thousands of these. They discovered in one Assyrian king's library 20,000 clay tablets. Many of them are sitting in the basements of museums like the Louvre Museum or the British Museum, and nobody's yet read many of them, because not a lot of people can read this strange writing. So now we can understand that. The third of the greatest discoveries, the most important, it was here at the Dead Sea. On the northwest corner. By the way, anybody can't swim, come with me on the next 2, and you can come here and you'll learn to swim, because you can't sink in this sea. Don't go swimming in this water, however, if you've got a cut on. You'll know all about it. Very slimy feel it has to it, but a lovely place to swim in, actually, or to float in. That might be a better word. Anyway, here on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea in 1947, there at a place called Qumran, some young Bedouin boys were minding the clan's goats, when one of the goats strayed up into this area where there's lots of caves. And the boys threw a stone, evidently to get the goat to come back, to bring it back. They missed the goat, and the stone went into a cave, and they heard the sound of breaking pots. Now they thought, oh, maybe there's some treasure up there we could get our hands on. So they raced up there, but all they found were these old pots, and inside some very, very old scrolls. Well, they took them back to the Bedouin clan, and then the Bedouin clan took them to Bethlehem, where they sold them to an antiquities dealer by the name of Mr. Kando, who bought them for the massive price of $100. Just a few years later, those scrolls were selling for $500,000. Man, I wish I was Mr. Kando. Someone made some good money. And of course, today these scrolls are priceless, and they're famously known as the Dead Sea Scrolls because, of course, where they were found. They've even found some recently. They keep finding some as they keep looking there in the Dead Sea area. Now, why are they so valuable? What's the reason they fetch such a good price? Well, number one, they're very old, and anything old sort of fetches a good price, doesn't it? How old were they? Well, we know from three sources how old they were or are. Firstly, the style of the script they're written in. We know because script styles change through time. For example, if you try to read 16th century English, most of us would have a hard time reading it. It's still English, but it's changed as time's gone on. So they knew what time period this type of writing of the Hebrew language came in, so they could use that. They did radiocarbon dating on these scrolls, and they also found coins. Now the coins didn't have, 2000 BC on them, but they had pictures of of kings or so, and that helps us to date. So with these three methods, we know today they date back to 100 to 200 BC. So about 2,200 years old, roughly. All right. Now the second thing, and this is the most important for us tonight, is that these scrolls, many of them contain ancient predictions with a very proven track record, and we're going to see that this evening as we progress. Well, what were these scrolls? Well, about 30% were the rules of the group that copied them. It's believed they were a group of Jewish monks, we could say, men out there in the desert of Judea living on their own, and so 30% were their rules. Another 30% roughly were their beliefs that this group held. And the biggest proportion, just over 40%, were copies of what you may have at home, copies of the Bible, the biblical manuscripts, except the book of Esther. They found copies of every one of them except the book of Esther. Now, if you've been to a motel, you've probably seen a Bible. Maybe you have one at home. Well, that's the first section, where they call it the Old Testament. That was that portion of it. They found that, almost every book. Now, what the scholars found was, the third thing was this. Essentially, there was no change in the Dead Sea Scrolls reading and what you may have in your Bible at home or you've seen in a motel. See, scholars thought that if you copy the originals and someone copies the copy of the original and someone copies the copy of the copy of the copy of the original, and you keep copying, you're going to introduce a bunch of mistakes, right? You've played Chinese whispers. We pass it around the room here, and when we get it back, it's all mixed up and gobbledygook from where we started from. So they said, well, surely that will be the case. But when they checked it, essentially no difference in meaning. Now, we probably have a pretty good idea why that's the case, because we know the Jewish scribes had very particular ways of copying. For example, sometimes when they copied a document from what they had, they would, when they'd finished copying, they would do a word count. And if the number of words on their copy that they'd made were different than what they were copying from, screw the thing up and throw it away and start again. Now you imagine, they found almost 2 complete scrolls of the prophet Isaiah's writings. They were 9 meters long. Imagine if the guy's copying, he gets to the very last sentence and he makes a boo-boo. Oh, mama. Screw it up and start all over again. That's a very long scroll. So we know this is probably why they were very particular in their copying. All right, now what we can do now, because these have predictions with with a proven track record, well, we're going to see that, we're going to compare those. Is it historically accurate? Does it come with that for its predictions? And does it have a good batting average? What's its batting average like? All right, so let's do it. Let's go to ancient Babylon first of all. This is in Iraq that you can visit. Well, probably not a good place to visit right now, but lots of things they've discovered from Babylon. Let's first of all mention this guy, Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was on his way to destroy the city of Jerusalem. And when he got to the city of Jerusalem, he was met by some Jewish priests who showed him a prophecy from the book of Daniel, which is part of the Dead Sea Scroll collection. Once they showed him the prediction, Alexander the Great decided not to destroy Jerusalem, and he continued on down to Egypt. You see, Alexander the Great of Greece was trying to get rid of all the Medo-Persians, who had been the number one superpower in the Middle Eastern world, Mediterranean world. And he had come from Tyre to destroy Jerusalem, but when he was shown that prediction, he kept going. So what was in this prediction that changed Alexander the Great's mind? We're going to find that out as we proceed. 332 BC, Alexander the Great came. How come it changed his mind? All right, we want to go to the book of Daniel chapter 8, and we're going to see some interesting things here. The book of Daniel was a favourite book of the Jewish people, of these people who were copying it, all right? It dates back to 100 to 200 BC. We have many fragments of the book of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. It was evidently a favourite of them. Now, I want to begin by showing you that the book of Daniel was clearly written in the 6th century BC. That's the 500 BC, all right? And we want to see that, because otherwise people might think maybe this was written after the event to make it look like a prediction, because that could easily happen if it was written, way after. Let's see how old it really is. We know from three methods how old it is. First of all, Jesus of Nazareth, who archaeologists and historians know was a real person, he refers to the book of Daniel when he was here. That's the 1st century, so it's at least that old. But of course the Dead Sea Scrolls date back to the 3rd century, so the book of Daniel's at least that old because it's in that collection, lots of it. And then of course Alexander the Great came along, and he decided not to destroy Jerusalem because of the prediction, and he's in the 4th century, the 300 BC, so at least dates back to the 4th century, back at that time. But also there are details in the book of Daniel that could only be known if you lived in the 6th century BC. Let me show you a couple. The last king of Babylon, according to the book of Daniel, was King Belshazzar. Now you've probably all heard about the writing on the wall. We use that phrase in our language, the writing's on the wall. Where does that come from? It comes from the book of Daniel, because Daniel tells about King Belshazzar, who was having a big party one night while the Medo-Persians were outside, surrounded the city, besieging it, and a bloodless hand begins to write a message on the plaster of the palace wall. And so the story goes, all right? Now, in that 5th chapter, Daniel says the last king of Babylon, because the king died that night, he says, was Belshazzar. Now, historians said that's wrong. That's not true at all. That's a Bible mistake. That's a blunder. We know it was a king called Nabonidus, they said. Well, then the archaeologists got working in the Middle East from the 1800s on, and they discovered this cylinder, for example. This is known as the cylinder of Nabonidus. You can see it in the British Museum. It's actually only about that big, not a very long one. And on it, it says Belshazzar was the son of Nabonidus. So now they knew, this guy did exist. He's not a make-up name, not a make-up person. But was he the king? That's another question. Then they kept digging, and they discovered this chronicle called the Nabonidus Chronicle. Now, on this clay tablet, this is what it says. Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to Belshazzar in the 3rd year of his reign. Now we know, the Bible was actually right. Because we know what happened. Nabonidus, actually, he was a bit of a religious recluse sort of guy. He went out to Tema in Saudi Arabia, did his religious thing, and said, boy, you can look after Babylon, you'll be the king while I'm gone. A co-regent, we call it. So the historians had to back up and say, oh, the Bible was right, we were wrong. Now this happens again and again. We'll give you some more examples that they said it was wrong, but they turned out that it was historically accurate. By the way, Daniel, when he says he comes in to read that writing, because the king says, Daniel, if you can read that writing on the wall from that hand that's made it, you will be the third ruler. You see, the first one would be Nabonidus, the second would be the co-regent Belshazzar, and okay, he makes him the third one. So what the Bible says, scholars found was true. Only known if you lived in the 6th century BC. Here's another one. Scholars now know that the book of Daniel is actually written in 2 languages. It's written in Hebrew and what we call Aramaic, the common language of the time, parts of it in Aramaic. And the type of Aramaic that is used in the book of Daniel is a 6th century BC Aramaic. So we know that this book was written in the 6th century BC, so it happens before what we're going to find out in one of Daniel's writings. So let's go there. Let's go to the 8th chapter of the book of Daniel. So what we're seeing so far, historically accurate. What the book talks about, they've actually found. And we could do that if we went to Egypt, we went to Assyria, many places, but we're just giving an illustration here. Let's go to the 8th chapter for a prediction. In the 8th chapter, Daniel says he saw a war between a ram and a goat. These animals represented different powers. Notice what it says. He's told that the ram is Medo-Persia. Now he's writing in the 500s or the 6th century BC. The ram which you saw, having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia, because it was a dual empire. Now, historians know that that's exactly the case. This was an empire made up of the Medes and the Persians, and they toppled the Babylonians. Now, then I lifted up my eyes and I saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. So the 2 horns, one represents Media and Persia, he's saying, and the higher one, the stronger one, came up last. Now that's exactly what happened. The Medes were the first or the dominant partner of that coalition. And then they had a big fight between Cyrus the Persian and Astyages the Mede. And Cyrus won the battle, and from then on, the Persians were the dominant partner, and they were much stronger than the Medes had ever been. And exactly as the Bible predicted, that's what happened. The Persians became the dominant part as they came up next. But he continues. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will, and he became great. I want you to think about that. The Medes and the Persians, we know that's exactly where they went. They went north toward what we would say parts of South Russia, that area, Kazakhstan and so on and so forth, and then over towards the west, that is, we call it Turkey today. It was the area of the Lydians and so on, and then they went down into Egypt, south. They went north, west and south. Just as the Bible said, that's exactly what history shows us in their exploits. Now he's told the goat is Greece. And notice what it says here. The male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that's between its eyes, it had one horn, that is the first king. Now, who was the first king of the United Greek Empire? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great stomped all over the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern world when he came to power. He was only about 30 years of age. By the time he was about 32 or so, he's conquered almost everything to the borders of India. From there right across to Greece and down into Egypt. A tremendous general in terms of his ability. Now you can understand why when he came to Jerusalem, to defeat the Medes and the Persians, because he thought they were siding with the Medes and the Persians in Israel. You can understand when he's shown, you are going to beat the Medes and the Persians. That rather tickled his fancy. You're going to beat the Medes and the Persians, Alexander the Great. Oh, thank you so much. I won't destroy you guys because you made a good prediction about my future. So he didn't destroy them. Therefore the male goat grew very great. But when he became strong, the large horn, Alexander, was broken. He dies. And in place of it, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. 4 points of the compass, in other words. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. Now think of this. Daniel is writing this in 600s, around 500 BC, the 6th century, he's writing this. The Greeks are not coming for another 200 years to power. That's way down here in the 300s, but he's writing this in the 500s. Now, that's exactly what happened. If you know a little bit about your Greek history, Alexander the Great dies in the city of Babylon. When he dies, his plans for a vast empire collapse at that very point. They died with him because 4 of his generals fought for the control of the Greek Empire, and all they succeeded in doing by 301 BC was to split up Greece into 4 regions. And it was all over. Now the Bible had predicted that 200 years before, and it actually happened. All right, let's continue on. 4 notable ones, 4 horns in other words, they came up toward the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of them, talking about one of the winds of the earth, one of the 4 points of the compass, out of one of the 4 points of the compass came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great. The Medo-Persia was great, Greece is very great, the next one's exceedingly great, you'll notice in the language used. Toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land, that's a name for Israel in the biblical manuscripts, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground and trampled on them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. The place of his sanctuary was cast down. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. What on earth is all that about, you're saying? Let's pull it to pieces, okay? Let's go through it one by one. This is an amazing prediction. The little horn, what does it represent? Well, who was it that toppled the Greeks? You know your school history? The Romans came next. They conquered the Greeks. Now the Romans, where did they go? They went south to Egypt. You've heard of Mark Antony, Cleopatra and all of that fascinating stuff. Hollywood's made it famous. They went east towards Mesopotamia. In fact, you can visit in Iran the very place where one of the Roman emperors was imprisoned because he went to fight the Sassanians and so on over there in Persia, and he never came home. Imprisoned by the people in Mesopotamia. No question. They went to Israel, the glorious land it's called in the biblical manuscripts. It was 63 BC when General Pompey brought his troops into what we call the Levant, places like Jordan, Israel, Syria, and they came to that part in 63 BC. It was greater than Greece, exceedingly great. It toppled the Greeks. They took over from the Greeks in the Mediterranean, Middle Eastern world. It was the Romans who stood against what is called the Prince of Princes in the Bible. That means Jesus, the King of Kings. The Romans were the ones who crucified Christ on the cross. You've seen, the blockbuster movie, The Passion of the Christ. What is it, Mel Gibson's movie? It was the Romans that did that for the Jewish people. It was the Romans that cast down the sanctuary of the Jews, or it's called the temple. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple. That's well documented in history and archaeology. We'll see that a little later on. It took away the daily temple services because the temple's gone, no services take place anymore because of the destruction of the temple. And finally, the Romans trampled on God's people. This is a reference to the host and the God's people, the stars are trampled on, because God's people are referred to as stars in the book of Daniel. Now, It trampled on them. When did they do that? Well, if you've ever visited Rome, you've probably gone to the Colosseum. This is one of the places where Christians were fed to lions. Down the road at the Circus Maximus as well, they fed them to the lions. The Romans loved gore and blood, hence the gladiatorial battles. They loved violence. And one of the greatest events that they could have in the Roman games was to see a bunch of Christians torn apart by dogs or lions. They loved it. I mean, how bizarre is that? But that was the Romans, tragically, back in those times. They would put some of the Christians on crosses, put tar over them, and set them alight to have light for their games to keep going. It was really quite horrific. Anyway, the point is this. There were very precise predictions in this prophecy of Daniel, 500 BC at least, and now look at them. The Medo-Persians would come after the Babylonians, and they did. They would be a dual empire, was the prediction, 2 parts, Media and Persia, and they were. The Persians would come up last and be greater, and that's what took place, was the prediction. The Medo-Persians would go in 3 directions, north, south and west, and they did. The Greeks were named 200 years before. Actually, he mentions the Greeks coming, and how that on the death of the first king, Greece would be split into 4, and they were. And then finally, the little horn representing Rome would be greater than the Greeks, and they were. It went south to Egypt. The Romans would go east to Mesopotamia. They would kill the prince of princes, it said, the Christ, and they went to Israel. They killed the Christ, and they destroyed Israel's temple, and finally they ended its temple services, and lastly, he says, they killed scores of Christians. All of that was predicted, and all of that was fulfilled. So what we have here is either this is just luck or something supernatural is going on here, because you can't make those predictions and get it all right without somebody giving you some insights, because they're writing this in the 500 BC, and yet way down here to the Romans and the time of Christ is 500 years later, and beyond that for the persecution of the Christians. So this is the most reliable source for knowing the future. Now, we've only looked at one prophecy here to see its prophetic accuracy and its historical reliability, but that's in the past. What about in our day? Well, in our next presentation, we're going to come right down to our own time, from Daniel's time, 500 BC, 2,500 years ago. He predicts things that are happening today. We'll see that in our next presentation. Historical accuracy, and that's why this archaeologist, Sir W.F. Albright, worked for many years in the Middle East. He was one of the greatest archaeologists of our age. He wrote over 800 works on archaeology and related topics, and he was the director at one time of the American School of Oriental Research. We call it ASOR for short. That's like the creme de la creme archaeological society for the Middle East. So this guy's no fool. He's dug there for many years. I want you to notice what he said when it came to the biblical manuscripts. In the centre of history stands the Bible. Thanks to modern research, he's meaning archaeology, we can now recognise its substantial historicity. It's historically accurate. It doesn't make up stories. It's telling what happened exactly. To sum it up, he says, we can now treat the Bible from beginning to end as an authentic document of religious history. We find it reliable, he's saying. In fact, that's why archaeologists use the Bible in their work in the Middle East, because it helps them in what they're trying to find out. It's one of the sources that they use. So we have a proven track record also of dependable predictions. There are actually 800 prophetic verses in this book. 90% of them have already been fulfilled in the civilizations and predictions made about Egypt, made about Assyria, made about Israel, made about the Romans and so on. So there's only 10% left to be fulfilled, and that's the ones we'll be looking at. That's soon to be fulfilled, and many of them right now in process, and we'll see some of those in the rest of our presentation. So I think you can see how this is a reliable source for knowing the future. We're going to look at predictions dealing with our own time as we go to the next presentation, The Last Empire, Ancient Mysteries Reveal the Future. I think you probably should stand. Maybe you want to go to the bathroom quickly, but in 5 minutes we're going to start again, so go to a quick pit stop, right? But you might want to drink of water, stretch your arms, your legs, and we'll come back in 5 minutes.